Have you ever heard a story so absurd that it sounds like a myth, but isn't? In the late 1800s, in elegant Victorian England, a world obsessed with manners, modesty, and morality, doctors prescribed one of the strangest treatments in history. They genuinely believed that women were suffering from a disease called hysteria. And their cure, not herbs, not surgery, but something much more intimate. Before you jump to conclusions, yes, the title you clicked is true. Doctors actually performed physical treatments that caused women to, well, let's just say, reach a very unusual kind of relief. But here's the twist: they didn't think it was sexual at all. So how did a society that couldn't even talk about ankles invent a medical practice this bizarre? Let's go back to the beginning. Back then, medicine wasn't exactly scientific. Doctors didn't have the tools or knowledge we rely on today. The human body was still a mystery wrapped in superstition, especially the female body. Victorian women lived under enormous pressure, corsets pulled tight, smiles fixed in place, emotions buried deep. Society expected them to be graceful, pure, and quiet. But when a woman couldn't sleep, cried too often, felt anxious or angry or even uncooperative, doctors had a diagnosis ready: hysteria. Hysteria came from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. Ancient physicians, including Hippocrates, once believed that a woman's uterus could wander inside her body, pressing on organs, causing anxiety, sadness, or even madness. By the 19th century, that idea had evolved, or rather, refused to die. Doctors now claimed that hysteria was caused by sexual frustration. But of course, in Victorian culture, women were not supposed to feel desire at all. So instead of acknowledging it, they medicalized it. And here's where the story takes its shocking turn. A woman would visit her doctor with symptoms like nervousness, irritability, fatigue, or a tendency to cause trouble. The prescription: pelvic massage performed by the doctor until the woman reached what they described as paroxysm. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? But the doctors insisted it wasn't sexual, it was simply a medical release. They genuinely believed this treatment balanced the female body's energy. Imagine the contradiction. A society that covered table legs because they were too suggestive. Yet behind closed doors, doctors performed this therapy in their clinics. Now, let's pause for a second. It's easy to laugh or judge the Victorians, but remember, most people then didn't even know basic biology. Many doctors were men who had never even studied the female anatomy properly. In fact, medical textbooks from the 1800s described women as weaker, more emotional versions of men. So, in their logic, if a woman cried or argued, it wasn't because she was sad or angry, it was because her uterus was acting up. One London physician, Dr. George Taylor, wrote that hysteria affected as many as 3 out of 4 women. Think about that, 3 out of 4. By those numbers, nearly every woman in England was sick. And business was booming. Doctors had long waiting lists of wealthy women who came in for weekly treatments. But here's the problem: this therapy took a lot of time. Some sessions lasted hours. Doctors complained in journals that the procedure caused hand cramps and exhaustion. Yes, you heard that right, physicians actually complained about fatigue from treating so many patients. Now, this is where the story becomes even more ironic and revolutionary. To save time, some clever doctors started looking for mechanical help. In 1880, an English physician named Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville invented a new device. He called it the percussor. It was a handheld electric machine designed to speed up the massage process. Granville insisted his invention was strictly medical, used to relax muscles. But the doctors who bought it, they knew exactly what kind of muscles they were relaxing. So now, the treatment that began as a doctor's hands became a business of buzzing machines. Within a few decades, these devices would evolve into something you could buy at home, marketed in catalogs as household massagers. Women could now self-treat their hysteria in privacy. And just like that, One of history's strangest medical myths led to one of the earliest consumer electronics ever sold to women. It's strange, isn't it? A world where women were denied education, silenced in public, forced to hide their bodies, yet their doctors unknowingly created one of the first steps toward female autonomy. They didn't mean to empower women, but history has a funny way of turning absurdity into progress. So next time you hear someone talk about Victorian hysteria, remember, it wasn't just a bizarre medical condition. It was a mirror reflecting everything the Victorians feared about women, their emotions, their independence, and yes, their hidden desires. But that's just the beginning, because in the next part, we'll dive deeper into how this single idea, hysteria, shaped marriage, medicine, and morality for decades to come. And trust me, what came next was even stranger. Imagine being a woman in Victorian England, a world where emotions were dangerous and silence was considered elegance. You were told how to dress, how to sit, how to breathe. Desire was not just forbidden, it was invisible. But inside every home, behind every lace curtain, there was something bubbling beneath the calm: frustration, exhaustion, loneliness. And when these emotions became too much, when a woman cried, shouted, or simply refused to smile, her husband didn't think she needed love or understanding. He thought she needed a doctor. Doctors described hysteria as the plague of womanhood. Symptoms included, and I'm not exaggerating, boredom, anxiety, daydreaming, irritability, or even too much imagination. Basically, if a woman had any emotion at all, she could be diagnosed as hysterical. It wasn't just unmarried women either. Wives were often brought in by their husbands, embarrassed and confused, saying, "Doctor, she's been emotional lately." The doctor would nod seriously, write in his notes, and declare, "Yes, sir, classic case of female hysteria." And just like that, a normal, healthy woman became a patient. Inside the clinic, the air smelled of lavender oil and medicine. Women sat quietly in waiting rooms, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to know what was about to happen. Because, of course, no one talked about it, not even the patients. Doctors would call it a pelvic massage. Women were told to relax, breathe, and release tension. They weren't told what was actually happening. Most of them had no real understanding of sexuality at all. And when it was over, the doctor would simply write in his ledger, "Paroxysm achieved, patient relieved, next appointment in 1 week." By the late 1800s, this treatment wasn't just a medical practice, it was an industry. Doctors earned small fortunes treating wealthy women. Some physicians even built entire clinics dedicated to hysteria therapy. One American doctor proudly wrote that his clinic handled as many as 10 women a day. But he wasn't proud for the reason you might think. He complained that it was exhausting. He said it is a laborious process. The physician's hands and patients are taxed severely. So what did he do? He hired assistants, sometimes nurses, sometimes apprentices. They were taught how to perform pelvic massage as a legitimate medical procedure. Think about that. In a society where even discussing women's pleasure was sinful, this was happening every day inside respectable clinics, with everyone pretending it was medicine. It's hard to imagine how such a contradiction survived so long, but the truth is it worked because no one dared to question it. Men didn't understand it and women weren't allowed to. The result: decades of quiet, secret therapy sessions performed under the mask of science. Then came Dr. Granville, the man we met earlier, who claimed to be exhausted from treating too many patients. In 1880, he introduced a mechanical device to help the percussor. He insisted that it was for muscle treatment only. He wrote angrily in one letter, "It is not intended for the treatment of hysteria, nor should it be used in such a ridiculous way." But once his design hit the market, hundreds of doctors bought it and did exactly that. The electric vibrator had been born. And just like that, the first consumer massage device appeared in advertisements. By the early 1900s, women could buy their own machines, labeled as relaxation tools for home treatment. The ads used vague phrases like, relieves nervous tension, soothes the female constitution, brings calm and balance to the home. Everyone knew what it meant, but no one said it aloud. Here's the fascinating irony. This absurd, pseudoscientific practice accidentally gave women something they'd never had before: control over their own pleasure. Doctors believed they were fixing women, but in truth, they were teaching them that their bodies could feel something powerful, something they'd been told to ignore all their lives. In a time when women couldn't vote, couldn't own property, and had no voice in marriage, their bodies became the first place they quietly rebelled. Some historians now argue that this so-called treatment was one of the earliest catalysts for the sexual revolution that would come many decades later. A small, private act, repeated in silent rooms, slowly changed how women thought about their own bodies. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The same society that tried to suppress female desire created the tools that freed it. And yet for decades, no one admitted what was really happening. Even in medical journals, you'll find absurd lines like, "The paroxysm is a normal physiological event, achieved without moral consequence." Without moral consequence. That was their way of saying, don't worry, it's not pleasure, it's medicine. But beneath that silence, something was changing. Women began to whisper to one another. Some refused treatment. Some laughed quietly when their doctors spoke of medical necessity. And a few brave women started to write, anonymously, about the experience of hysteria therapy. They didn't use explicit language, but their words carried meaning between the lines. The treatment left me calm, almost renewed, as if something within me had been awakened. Those small, coded sentences were the beginning of something much bigger, an awakening of awareness that had been buried for centuries. So let's recap. A medical myth born from ignorance, doctors exhausted from performing treatments, an invention meant to save time, and a silent revolution disguised as therapy. That's the story of how one of the strangest medical practices in history became an accidental gateway to freedom. For thousands of women who were told they had a disease, when all they really had were feelings. You see, by the mid-1800s, hysteria wasn't just a diagnosis anymore, it was fashionable. Women of every social class were being told that their sadness, their exhaustion, even their curiosity was a medical problem. It became a quiet epidemic, one that said more about men's fears than women's bodies. Doctors called it the disease of civilization. They said the female body simply wasn't designed to handle modern life. Too much thinking, too much stimulation, too much independence. Can you imagine? Just existing as a woman in the Victorian world was considered a medical risk. In England and America, hundreds of doctors suddenly realized that hysteria could make them rich. It was the perfect disease, chronic, invisible, and profitable. Women would return every week, desperate for relief, and the cure only lasted a few days. One famous physician in Boston even called hysteria treatment a reliable stream of income. He said, almost proudly, "There is no ailment more dependable to the practicing physician." And the patients? They were loyal. They came back again and again, embarrassed but grateful, because in a world that denied them comfort, that 15-minute appointment was often the only moment they felt seen, touched, or cared for. It's haunting, isn't it? Something so intimate being turned into routine business. Inside the doctor's office, everything was ritualized. A clean cloth, a faint smell of oil, the patient lying still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the doctor murmuring instructions. "Relax, Mrs. Pembroke, breathe deeply." He would begin what was called manual therapy, movements performed with professional detachment. No one spoke about pleasure. The doctor wasn't supposed to think of it that way. But the women who experienced paroxysm, the sudden convulsion, the trembling release, described it as something between relief and awakening. Of course, they couldn't say that. So instead, they said they felt better, lighter, cured. The language of medicine had become the mask of desire. It's easy for us to laugh at it now. To think, how could anyone believe this? But remember, this was a world where women weren't even taught what their own anatomy looked like. In school books, drawings of female organs were removed or labeled improper. Girls were told that good wives didn't think about pleasure and good husbands didn't discuss it. And in that silence, medicine filled the gap, pretending to cure what it refused to understand. Doctors described the paroxysm, what we now know as orgasm in medical terms, like a crisis, a nervous discharge, or muscular spasm leading to temporary calm. It sounds almost mechanical, and yet the irony is those sessions were the closest many women ever came to physical satisfaction. What fascinates historians isn't just the absurdity of it all, it's the sincerity. Many doctors genuinely believed they were helping. They weren't predators, at least most weren't. They were men trapped in their own ignorance. The medical system had built a wall between science and intimacy, and both sides believed they were doing the right thing. The women got relief, the doctors got paid, and society stayed blind to what was really happening. That's how the lie survived for almost a century. By the late 19th century, the world was electrifying, literally. Factories, homes, and hospitals began adopting electric power. Inventors saw an opportunity to bring this efficiency into the world of medicine. And that's where things got strange. Newspaper ads appeared for devices like the vibratal massager and the portable electrotherapeutic apparatus. They promised relief for female weakness and nervous tension. Of course, those were polite phrases for the same old thing, hysteria treatment. The machines were sold to doctors, spas, and eventually, directly to households. In fact, by 1905, one American catalog listed the vibrator right next to hair curlers and sewing machines. It was marketed as a domestic appliance, and people bought it by the thousands. Think about the irony. The same culture that treated female desire as dangerous was now selling it in plain sight, wrapped in the language of wellness. Women could finally treat themselves at home, but they weren't told what that really meant. It was the perfect loophole, a rebellion hiding inside respectability. For many women, that small mechanical device wasn't just a cure for hysteria. It was freedom. For centuries, society had denied women ownership of their bodies. But now, in the privacy of their bedrooms, they were discovering something profound, that they didn't need a man or a doctor to make them feel alive. It's subtle, almost invisible, but historians now call this the silent emancipation. It didn't happen in protests or speeches. It happened in quiet rooms, in flickering lamplight, with the hum of a small electric motor. And slowly, everything changed. Women began to see their emotions not as diseases, but as signals, as parts of themselves they had the right to understand. But of course, every revolution meets resistance. And as the 20th century approached, a new kind of moral panic began to spread. Church leaders, social reformers, and even other doctors started asking uncomfortable questions. What exactly are these machines doing? Is this proper for women of faith? Could this so-called cure be sinful? Their fear wasn't about health, it was about control. And that fear would lead to one of the most ironic twists in medical history, the moment when hysteria treatment, once a respected science, became the ultimate taboo. By the late 19th century, something had begun to shift. The doctors who once confidently prescribed pelvic massage as medical treatment were starting to feel uneasy. The world around them was changing faster than they could control. Electric light had arrived. Women were reading more, questioning more, and even speaking publicly about their health. And somewhere in the tension between science and morality, a reckoning was brewing. Victorian society had always lived with a double face. By day, it spoke of purity, modesty, and virtue. By night, it buried desire under the weight of silence. But now, whispers were spreading in polite circles that doctors were doing something unholy, that the so-called hysteria cure wasn't a treatment at all, but a sin wrapped in medical language. Priests began to warn their congregations. The body must be governed by the soul, not the other way around. For the first time, medicine found itself accused not of ignorance, but of indecency. In 1889, a physician in London stood before his colleagues and nervously asked, "Gentlemen, have we perhaps mistaken the cause for the cure?" The room fell silent. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone knew what he meant. They were treating something they didn't understand, a problem they had invented, and a solution that was never supposed to exist. That moment was the beginning of the end. By the early 1900s, Freud entered the scene. Yes, that Freud. The young Austrian doctor who dared to say the unthinkable, that hysteria wasn't a disease of the body, it was a reflection of the mind. He believed women weren't sick. They were suppressed. Their emotions, their needs, their anger, all pushed so deep inside that their bodies had to find a way to speak when words were forbidden. And in that one radical theory, Freud didn't just end the era of manual therapy. He exposed the moral hypocrisy that had sustained it. Freud replaced the doctor's touch with conversation. He told his patients to talk, to remember, to dream. It was the birth of psychoanalysis and the death of the so-called hysteria cure. But let's not pretend this change was entirely progressive. It was just another kind of control. Where once the male doctor controlled the woman's body, now he claimed mastery over her mind. Different tool, same power. And then something almost tragic happened. The word hysteria began to vanish. By the 1920s, it disappeared from medical textbooks altogether. The same term that had defined women's health for centuries was quietly erased, as if to cover up the embarrassment of its own absurdity. But in that erasure, women's suffering disappeared too. Because underneath all the pseudoscience, hysteria had been about something real: loneliness, exhaustion, trauma, repression. Once the diagnosis was gone, those same emotions were labeled nervousness or depression and still misunderstood. The silence returned, just in a different form. You see, history rarely moves forward in a straight line. It bends, it hides, it circles back on itself. When hysteria died, people didn't become wiser overnight. They just found new words for the same old pain. The vibrator was pushed into secrecy. Doctors stopped advertising it. Manufacturers rebranded it as a beauty device or muscle relaxer. Women who once could buy it openly now had to hide it. A quiet revolution was forced back into the shadows. Imagine those women now. They didn't have the language to explain what they felt, but they knew something was wrong with how they were treated. They knew that their bodies were not broken, only misunderstood. Many of them lived entire lives without ever being told what that treatment really was. They trusted their doctors. They thought they were healing. And in a strange, sad way, maybe they were. Because even if society didn't understand it, that moment of release, that fragile human connection, was real. It was their body's quiet act of rebellion. What makes this story so haunting isn't the absurdity of the treatment, it's the reason it existed at all. The entire concept of hysteria was born from fear. Fear of women thinking too much, feeling too deeply, wanting too freely. And as long as that fear existed, society kept finding new ways to call women ill. Whether it was hysteria, or later female anxiety, or even attention-seeking, the label always served the same purpose: to silence. In 1892, a woman named Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters, but about something much more terrifying: the prison of being a woman labeled hysterical. The story follows a woman locked in her bedroom by her husband, who's also her doctor. He forbids her to write, to think, to express. He tells her that rest will cure her, but that rest slowly drives her mad. The wallpaper becomes her only world until she begins to see something moving behind it. A woman, trapped, crawling, trying to escape. Pause. Soft heartbeat-like sound. Gilman's story wasn't fiction, it was testimony. She herself had been prescribed the rest cure by a famous physician who told her to never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. When she refused, she wrote. And in writing, she reclaimed her voice. That was the first crack in the wall of hysteria. The industrial age was changing everything, not just machines but minds. Women were working, earning, reading newspapers. They were no longer just patients, they were witnesses. And as the medical world moved forward, something strange happened. The more science tried to define women's bodies, the less it understood their experiences. Doctors still used words like fragile, delicate, and emotional. But women began to realize those words weren't medical terms. They were excuses, excuses to keep control. In 1910, women started entering medical schools. It was shocking to many, even scandalous. But their presence changed everything. They asked questions that male doctors never had. Like, what if this isn't an illness? What if the problem isn't the body, but society? And slowly that question, that small spark, began to burn through the myth of hysteria. While doctors were retreating from the topic, the world of technology was racing ahead. Electricity had arrived in the home, and with it, the vibrator changed form again. Now it wasn't found in medical offices. It was in catalogs, advertised as a portable relief device for feminine fatigue. Of course, no one said what that really meant, but women knew. The vibrator became one of the first electrical appliances ever sold for home use, years before the iron, the vacuum cleaner, or even the toaster. Think about that. Before households had electricity for cooking, they had it for healing. By the Roaring '20s, pleasure had become a quiet rebellion. Women were cutting their hair short, wearing trousers, driving cars. The world of corsets and confinement was being replaced with movement and laughter. But deep inside, the shadow of hysteria still lingered. Because even as women gained more freedom, society still struggled with one question. What happens when a woman's happiness doesn't depend on a man? The answer frightened people. In 1929, the Wall Street crash shook the world. Economies fell, but something else rose: introspection. Psychoanalysis was everywhere now. Freud had become a household name, and his theories about repressed desire fascinated the public. For the first time, people were saying words out loud that had been forbidden: desire, frustration, satisfaction. And yet, Freud's ideas still centered on men. The female condition was explained through male desire, male fear, and male authority. That's when a new generation of women psychologists, like Karen Horney, challenged Freud himself. She said, "It is not women who envy men's anatomy, it is men who fear women's independence." That sentence changed everything. The story of hysteria had always been about control, but now, for the first time, it was about resistance. And so hysteria transformed again, this time, into something unrecognizable. It became a metaphor for rebellion. Artists used it, poets used it, even early feminists used it to describe how it felt to be silenced for centuries. In a way, hysteria evolved from an illness into a language. A language that said, "We were never sick, we were never broken, you just never listened." But even as society began to unlearn the myth, another, quieter revolution was brewing behind closed doors in laboratories, universities, and film reels. Science was about to discover what hysteria had been hiding all along: that women's pleasure, far from being pathological, was an essential part of human biology, health, and happiness. And this time, it wouldn't be hidden. You can almost feel it, can't you? The silence that followed, the end of hysteria. A word that had haunted women for centuries, gone. Erased from medical textbooks, left behind in the same dark corners that once held corsets and fainting couches. But the echo of that idea didn't disappear. It just changed shape. And if you listen closely, you'll hear how that echo turned into something new, something louder, freer, and a little dangerous. As the 20th century dawned, medicine took a new path. The strange rituals of the Victorian clinic, the massages, the therapy gave way to talk of the mind. Doctors stopped calling it hysteria. Now it was psychosomatic disorder. Same confusion, new name. But there was a man who would change how the world thought about desire, even if he didn't fully understand it himself. His name was Sigmund Freud. Freud didn't believe in hysteria the way Victorians did. To him, it wasn't a disease of the womb, it was a disturbance of the mind, a hidden storm of repressed feelings, of things too scandalous to speak. And for many women, his theories felt like the first time anyone had tried to listen, not to their bodies, but to their silence. Freud said something radical for his time, that women's hysteria wasn't madness but a symptom of unfulfilled desire. He called it repression. He called it the unconscious. And suddenly, the secret subject of pleasure was being whispered not just in bedrooms, but in lecture halls. But, and this is where it gets complicated, Freud was still a man of his age. He spoke of penis envy, of women as incomplete, their pleasure a secondary reflection of men's. His theories broke open the door, yes, but they didn't set women free. They simply gave the old beliefs a new vocabulary. But not everyone agreed with him. There were women fierce, intelligent, relentless, who refused to let Freud's ideas define them. One of them was Karen Horney, a psychoanalyst who dared to say that Freud had it backwards. She said women didn't envy men. They envied freedom, power, autonomy. The world had built itself around male desire, and when women reached for their own, it called them sick. Karen argued that hysteria wasn't a sexual dysfunction. It was a rebellion against limitation, a cry from a body that had been silenced for too long. And suddenly, hysteria wasn't a diagnosis anymore. It was a metaphor for every century of suppressed voice, every hidden emotion, every whispered story that history refused to write down. While these debates unfolded, something else was happening quietly, far from Freud's office, in art, in writing, in the shadows of a world at war. Women were breaking the rules. Writers like Anais Nin began to explore female desire not as an illness, but as an art. Painters like Tamara de Lempicka turned sensuality into bold, geometric elegance. And even though society tried to hide it, the world was changing. The lines between medicine, art, and desire were blurring. The vibrator, once a doctor's instrument, became a symbol of independence. And in the privacy of their homes, women began to reclaim something sacred, their right to feel. The age of Freud gave way to the age of science. Electricity wasn't new anymore. Radio waves were connecting continents. Machines could move faster than thought. And as the world accelerated, so did the conversation about the human body. Doctors began to study hormones, reproduction, and the psychology of intimacy, not as something shameful, but as part of being alive. But make no mistake, society still struggled to catch up. Women were told they could study, work, and vote, but not talk about their own pleasure. The same double standard that had fueled hysteria was still alive, just dressed in modern clothes. It would take another revolution to change that. And maybe that's the strange beauty of this story. Because what began as a bizarre medical treatment slowly revealed a truth humanity had buried for centuries, that pleasure isn't chaos. It isn't sickness, it's connection, it's expression, it's proof that we are alive. For the Victorian doctors, it was just anatomy. For Freud, it was repression. But for the women who lived it, it was awakening. And even though their names were never written in history books, they were the ones who turned a treatment into a revolution. By the 1940s, hysteria was gone for good. No one believed in it anymore. Instead, a new field was born, sexology. Pioneers like Alfred Kinsey and Masters and Johnson studied human intimacy scientifically. They measured, observed, documented. And for the first time in recorded history, pleasure wasn't whispered about, it was analyzed openly. The word orgasm appeared in textbooks, not as a symptom, but as a part of health. That was the final payoff, the moment medicine finally caught up with what women had known all along. For so long, I thought something was wrong with me, but now I know I am not sick. I am simply alive. These were the final words written by a patient whose case had once been labeled severe hysteria. Her name is lost to history, but her truth, that quiet, defiant truth, echoes louder than any diagnosis ever could. So when you hear that strange old phrase, Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as treatment, remember this. It wasn't just about ignorance. It was about discovery, about a world trying to understand something it was too afraid to name. And in that awkward confusion between science and shame, something miraculous happened. The recognition of female desire as something real, powerful, and entirely human. That's not just history. That's evolution. The machines stopped buzzing long ago, but what they awakened that's still alive in every conversation, every confession, every quiet act of self-understanding that follows. And maybe that's the greatest twist in all of history. What started as a cure for madness ended up curing something much deeper, the world's fear of female pleasure. You've made it this far into the story. Strange, isn't it, how a medical treatment from over a century ago could open a door to something much bigger. Something that still shapes the way we think about women, the body, and pleasure, even today. Let's pick up right where we left off. The year is 1945. The war is ending. The world is exhausted, rebuilding, redefining itself. And in this moment of reconstruction, something else is quietly rebuilding, the image of the woman. After the war, women had seen too much. They'd worked in factories, driven trucks, built planes. They weren't fragile anymore, or maybe they never were. But society didn't know what to do with this new power. Doctors, psychologists, and advertisers all stepped in to help guide the modern woman. They told her how to act, how to look, how to feel. Posters smiled down from department store walls. Perfect wives, perfect mothers, perfectly calm. But behind those smiles, the old ghosts of the Victorian clinic still whispered. Hysteria had vanished from the textbooks, but not from the culture. Now it had a new name: anxiety, depression, nervous exhaustion. Different words, same dismissal. When women felt unfulfilled, it wasn't pleasure they were told to seek, it was pills. The vibrator that once hummed in doctors' hands was now quietly repackaged and sold in mail-order catalogs as a facial massager. Of course, everyone knew what it really was, but polite society pretended not to. That's how it's always been. Every time history got too close to female pleasure, it covered its eyes and called it something else. Then came the 60s, and everything began to crack open. The world had color again, the youth rebelled, the music got louder, and for the first time women didn't want to whisper anymore. They wanted to talk about work, about love, about desire. Books like The Feminine Mystique asked, "Is this all there is?" And the answer, the one buried for centuries, began to surface. Pleasure wasn't a symptom, it was a form of power. The feminist movement didn't just fight for jobs or equality, it fought for understanding, for ownership of the body. And slowly, that clinical narrative, the one that had reduced women's emotions to a diagnosis, started to crumble. This was the real revolution, not in hospitals or laboratories, but in living rooms and libraries, between friends sharing stories they'd been taught to hide. For centuries, women were told that pleasure was something men gave them. Now they were learning it was something they could claim. And the irony, that realization started with those old Victorian doctors, with the very treatment that was meant to cure them. As women's voices grew louder, science began to listen. In the 1950s, Alfred Kinsey released the Kinsey Reports, an explosive study on human sexuality. It revealed something shocking to conservative America. Women had complex, rich, and varied sexual experiences. They weren't passive. They weren't hysterical. They were human. Then came Masters and Johnson. They studied hundreds of volunteers and documented what really happens to the body during intimacy, every heartbeat, every reaction. Their research shattered centuries of myths. They proved that women could experience multiple orgasms, that their pleasure was not dependent on men, and that sexual satisfaction was a fundamental part of well-being. Can you imagine what that meant? For the first time, medical science wasn't using pleasure to control women. It was using it to understand them. And yet, even then, society still hesitated to speak too openly. Pleasure was acknowledged, yes, but still wrapped in polite silence. The medical journals had replaced hysteria with data, but emotion, passion, desire, those were still treated as private matters. That's the thing about history, it doesn't change overnight. It shifts quietly, one uncomfortable truth at a time. You might wonder, why did those Victorian doctors think they were helping? The answer is both tragic and human. They lived in a world that didn't allow women to express emotion, didn't let them desire or even be angry. So when women came to them trembling, frustrated, exhausted, the doctors saw illness, not oppression. They didn't see passion. They saw pathology. In their own strange way, they were trying to bring balance to what society had broken. They just didn't have the language or the courage to see the truth. But we do now. We have words they didn't, freedom they couldn't imagine. The question is, have we really used it? Because even today, women's pleasure is still a subject of discomfort. It's censored, controlled, commercialized, talked about but not always understood. The world still carries echoes of the Victorian age in medicine, in media, in silence. That's the real story hiding under that strange headline, not just why doctors gave women orgasms, but why the world still struggles to let them own it. But don't worry, this isn't where the story ends. Because what began in those dim, gaslit rooms didn't die there. It evolved. It became a symbol of rebellion, awareness, and awakening. And in our next and final chapter, we'll explore what that awakening means today. How the modern world continues to rewrite what pleasure, medicine, and freedom really mean. So here we are, the final chapter. We've walked through candle-lit clinics, heard the hum of early machines, and met doctors who thought they were curing something, when in reality they were uncovering something deeper, something they couldn't even name. But this is where their story becomes ours. It's easy to laugh at Victorian medicine now, their corsets, their superstition, their awkward understanding of the human body. But if you look closely, you'll realize that their legacy never really left us. Because every time a woman is told to calm down, every time her pain is dismissed as stress, every time her body becomes a mystery even to her own doctor, that's the echo of that same old diagnosis. Hysteria may not exist in medical books anymore, but it still exists between the lines. Science has advanced, yes. We've mapped DNA, cloned cells, even walked on the moon. But when it comes to women's pleasure, we still hesitate. We still whisper. Even in an age of endless information, some truths remain behind closed doors. But here's the good part, and it's one the Victorians could never have imagined. Women began to take back the narrative. Slowly at first, through conversations, through art, through research, through rebellion. In the 1980s and 90s, female scientists and sex educators started doing what no one before them dared to. They studied women's pleasure on their own terms. No hysteria, no shame, just understanding. They discovered that the human body, especially the female body, wasn't made to be mysterious. It was simply misunderstood. That realization changed everything. Now, pleasure is no longer a treatment. It's a conversation, a right. Entire movements grew from this, movements that demanded honesty in sex education, equity in healthcare, and dignity in how we talk about intimacy. And if you think about it, it all began in those dim, gaslit rooms where doctors turned a medical procedure into an accidental revolution. Today, that little machine is a relic, but not of shame. It's a reminder of how far we've come. Back then, it was a tool to suppress emotion. Now it symbolizes liberation. A century ago, it belonged to the doctor. Now it belongs to the woman. That's not just evolution, that's reclamation. The same invention that began in secrecy became one of the most powerful symbols of bodily autonomy in modern history. Isn't that poetic? A machine meant to quiet women ended up helping them find their voice. So what was the real cure all along? Not the device, not the treatment, not even the science. It was recognition. The moment society stopped treating pleasure as a symptom and started seeing it as a signal, that's when healing truly began. Victorian doctors thought they were fixing women, but in a strange, roundabout way, they helped expose the cracks in their own system. They made the world ask questions it had avoided for centuries, and those questions never went away. Because when you strip away all the taboos, what remains is simple. Every emotion, every desire, every heartbeat, they all mean something. They're not signs of madness. They're proof of being alive. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the Victorians were really afraid of. If you ever visit a medical museum, you might find one of those old treatment devices displayed behind glass. People walk by and chuckle. They take pictures. They see a strange, outdated curiosity. But you'll know the real story. You'll know that behind that quiet, mechanical hum was the sound of a revolution. A small, defiant reminder that even in an age of silence, the human body always finds a way to speak. And that is the true legacy of the Victorian orgasm cure. So the next time someone tells you history is boring, remember this. It's never just about the past. It's about how the past still lives in us. And sometimes, the most forbidden stories are the ones that teach us what freedom truly means.